helping students and institutions during unprecedented times, featuring Principal Deputy Undersecretary Diane Jones.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to join us by video this year. What a difference a year makes. Last year, when we gathered in Reno, many of us complained about how difficult it was to get to Reno. Here we are a year later, and probably like all of you, I'm wishing we could get on a plane and be in person and be together. Oftentimes, it's those conversations that take place in the hallway that are the most important of our interactions. But we're all making do. Hopefully, everybody is healthy and staying safe. And thanks for tuning in by video this year. One of the things that we all enjoy is we get to pick our entrance music. So when we have these events live, we each get to pick the song that we'd like to use as we walk on stage. For those of you who were here last year, you might remember I picked the Rolling Stones, "You Can't Always Get What You Want." And I feel like that song is just as applicable to today's scenario as it has been to any other in my life and certainly in the history of higher ed. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might get what you need. And that really has been the motto for our work with you and with students and borrowers, in particular over these last 8 months and certainly over the years that we've been together. So here we are, and we know that when COVID became a problem for all of us to try to deal with, we put regulatory flexibilities out to allow institutions to very quickly pivot to online learning. And there were people who questioned that and thought we were kind of crazy. They said, oh, institutions can't respond that quickly. And my response was, well, I think they can. I think institutions are incredibly resilient. And I think they will do whatever it takes to get to their students. And sure enough, without skipping a beat, all of you figured out how to continue serving your students in a way that protected them and your faculty and staff. And so I want to begin by saying we are incredibly grateful for all that you have done for your campuses and for your students. We just could not be more grateful for how you've worked with us, how you've partnered with us, and most importantly, how you've continued to serve your students in times that are very challenging and disconcerting for all. We have talked over the last couple of years about the importance of our partnership. And I hope that you have seen in our actions that we are true to our words. We see you as partners, and our goal was to strengthen that partnership, to make it clear that we saw you as our partner in serving students, and to stop what had been a pretty negative history of sort of congratulating ourselves for whatever went right and blaming you for whatever went wrong. I hope you've seen through our actions over the past few years, and in particular over the last year, that we have taken unprecedented steps to hold ourselves accountable, to be better partners with you, to make sure that you have the resources you need to serve your students. And so I'll go through some of the things that we've done, some of the changes that we've made that we believe demonstrate how important this partnership is to us. Most of you know we completed a number of negotiated rulemaking efforts and, in fact, have finalized a certain number of regulations. Our accreditation and state authorization regulation, it became final on July 1. And this regulation made a lot of really important changes, including some controversial changes. Most of you are aware we have eliminated the artificial distinction between regional and national accreditors. We did that because those distinctions were created when people traveled by horse and buggy. And what we realize today is that students travel all over the country and, in fact, around the world to go to college. We also recognized that even the accreditors that called themselves regional accreditors had accreditation activities in almost every state. And it became hard for us to explain to students why they were attending a campus on the East Coast that was accredited by a West Coast accreditor. We have eliminated those artificial distinctions, and we have made clear that we hold all accreditors to the same standards. And so now we recognize institutional accreditors and programmatic accreditors, but we do not distinguish within those two categories between regional and national. In fact, all accreditors function at the national level. So we think this is really important to help students understand how to figure out who the accreditor is for an institution. They now can understand that it doesn't really matter where the accreditor is located, that they have to understand that the importance of accreditation is that the accreditation agency has standards of rigor and their institution meets them. So we've made some important changes. We also allowed, through our new regulations, for accrediting agencies to have alternative standards. We have embraced this idea that one size does not fit all. And therefore, we know that accreditors need to have different standards for different institutions based on the mission of the school or the students that are served. And nothing has made it more obvious that we need alternative standards than COVID-19. Many accrediting agencies have standards for job placement rates, financial stability, and other parameters of outcomes or student success that make a whole lot of sense during normal times. But during these times, when job placement can be very difficult, when entire parts of our economy are functioning in a different way, it may not be the sign of an institution's quality if there are changes in student outcomes. Students are dealing with all kinds of things in their personal lives. And so this is an example of a time when alternative standards might be necessary to take into account the reality of financial challenges on campuses, job placement challenges, retention challenges. We know many students have decided to take a gap year. And so we want to reward you for your resilience rather than trying to have your accrediting agency criticize you because in these uncertain times, you can't quite function in the way that you once did. We also finalized our Teach Grant and our faith-based institutions regulation. And for all of you, probably the most important part of that regulation is that we have changed the way we run our Teach Grant program. We have eliminated artificial reporting deadlines. We think that this means that many fewer students will find themselves in an incorrectly converted situation where they've gone from a grant to a loan, even though they are fulfilling their service obligation. We've also expanded the way that a teacher could fulfill his or her service obligation, and we now include elementary school teachers in areas where they have been designated as high need. Our secretary understands that if you haven't done well in math by third grade, you may have challenges later on, and so we can't just wait till middle and high school to have the very best math teachers. We need elementary school teachers to be excellent and outstanding. We've also finalized our distance learning regulation. This one will not go into effect until July 1 of 2021. However, many elements of that regulation have been designated for early voluntary implementation, meaning that you can take advantage of those elements now, which includes better definitions of how to operate a subscription-based program. Understanding that reasonable program length means not just how many hours it would take to get licensed in the state in which the institution is located, but for a person who seeks licensure, how many hours of education would they need in an adjoining state? So we've expanded our rules around reasonable program length to take into account that many students will cross state lines, either to go to school or to work later on. So we've made a number of challenges there. We have other regulations that we finalized, including the gainful employment regulation. We rescinded the earlier regulation, which was based on a formula that was quite arbitrary and that did not identify the best functioning programs or the most effective programs, and in fact imposed requirements that our own regulations don't require in terms of student loan repayment lengths. We found under the old gainful employment regulation, 63 out of 64 programs that reported $0 in median earnings passed. And yet another program that posted almost $60,000 in median annual earnings failed. We think students can make better decisions if they have information about every program they're considering. And so instead of the gainful employment regulation, we have posted the first year results on the expanded college scorecard, which shows earnings and other program outcomes at the level of the academic program and the institution. So not only does a student have better information to pick the institution they want to attend, they also have better information to inform what they might expect in terms of earnings based on the program they select. And this is not to discourage students from pursuing their dreams and passions. This is to suggest to them that you can pursue your dreams, but in doing so, you need to borrow responsibly so that you'll be able to repay your loans once you enter your field. We have finalized regulations on Title IX, and we have most recently finalized regulations on free inquiry on college campuses. So we think that these regulations deliver on the promises we've been making for several years. We heard you. We heard what you said about regulatory burden, and we have tried to address it. Most recently, we have released a new guideline or a new chapter in the Federal Student Aid Handbook for Clery Act compliance. In other words, we're eliminating the handbook that had blossomed to over 200 pages. And we now have a shorter addendum that is in the Federal Student Aid Handbook that explains to institutions that we are following the law and our regulations without adding all kinds of new definitions and new requirements that were not contemplated by either the law or regulations. So, for example, we now defer to you to determine what your Clery Act geography is. We no longer believe that you should have to track down crime reports from foreign governments because you had a student who was traveling abroad. You know what your Clery Act geography is, and as long as you are clear to students and parents about what it is, we will defer to you. We no longer have the sidewalk rule. We think it was sort of silly that we required you to report on things that happened a mile into the woods just because it was next to your campus, or the waterway next door, unless, of course, you required students to swim from one class to the other. And we have made it clear that the Clery Act law never included diseases and never contemplated that inclusion. It was only through the handbook that people started to think they had to report campus outbreaks. Certainly, we think it's good practice, and we know that many of you will continue to inform students when there is a dangerous health threat, as we are seeing right now. But that's not a Clery Act requirement. It's not that you have to report that as part of your Clery Act report. So we really have addressed a number of the concerns that we've heard from all of you about regulatory burden. We have also tried to work more closely with students to improve student loan repayment. I mentioned this last year and perhaps the year before. I think it's not great that for years we pat ourselves on the back for handing money out, and then when students didn't pay it back, we wanted to blame you. We now recognize that it is our responsibility to help students repay their loans. And in fact, we have much better ways to reach out to students, and we have much more contact with students after they graduate than you do. So what have we done? Well, first of all, we've recognized that there is an increased reliance on income-driven repayment. Income-driven repayment is there to help borrowers manage their repayment obligation. But many students were relying on income-driven repayment, which was then being used to suggest that schools hadn't done their job well because students were reliant on income-driven repayment, a benefit that Congress provided. And it turns out that the department was not confirming the income or family size. So there were borrowers in income-driven repayment that perhaps shouldn't have been there, or that perhaps were paying a lower payment than their salary would have otherwise required them to pay. That's not your fault. That's our fault. And so we have implemented a pilot project to more carefully monitor and assess a borrower's income and family size. Now, we implemented that pilot in January, and as you all know, um, once the COVID-19 national emergency was declared, students with direct loans are in a non-payment status. So that pilot has been suspended. But once repayment begins, we will initiate the pilot to make sure that if students are benefiting from a reduced payment, they actually are deserving of that payment. And we no longer want to use that to try to demonstrate the quality of your program, because we understand that a debt management tool is a tool Congress made available to borrowers. And there are all kinds of reasons why students might want to take advantage of those kinds of repayment tools. We have launched the digital customer care environment, our front door to federal student aid. And for borrowers who now need to get information in real time about their loans, it's just there at their fingertips. They don't have to call their servicer. They don't even have to anticipate what question they perhaps should ask. They can go and use Aiden. They can use the chat feature to start asking questions. If they stump Aiden, they can then talk to a live person. But many borrowers can get the information they need simply by going to their account and seeing what loans they have. They now have a tool that they can use to manipulate to find out, well, if I use this repayment program, what would my monthly payment look like, and what would my total amount paid look like versus if I used another debt payment tool. So we're giving students the tools so that they can go online and experiment and see, well, if I did this, that might happen. If I think about consolidation, what would that cost me? What benefits might it bring to me? We also think that this tool is going to be helpful in allowing students to understand how much eligibility they have already used up and how much remains. We don't want to see students get to their last semester and discover that, oh, they don't have any more federal student aid eligibility. They can now monitor that in real time. And we have added this year, as a voluntary tool, the annual student loan acknowledgement, which next year will be mandatory. For a student to be able to get their student loan, they will have to go in and they will have to complete the questions that are included in the annual acknowledgement tool. And what that does is it makes sure students understand that they can borrow less than the maximum, so that they understand in total how much they've borrowed and what their total monthly payment might look like based on the loans they already have and the additional loan they're contemplating. In other words, we're taking responsibility to help borrowers change their behaviors, to borrow less, and to plan better for what repayment strategies are available to them. You will see in our strategic plan that we have recently released that we are holding ourselves to a higher degree of accountability. I think we went from having somewhere around 20 accountability metrics to now having well over 40. Not only are we holding ourselves accountable for things like giving out student aid, which obviously continues to be a high priority, we are also holding ourselves responsible for making sure that we educate borrowers about what it means to borrow responsibly. We're holding ourselves accountable for borrowers repaying their loans when they have to, when they should, when their income dictates. We are not just making ourselves accountable for providing you with technical assistance and training. We're holding ourselves accountable for the quality of that training. We are monitoring how many schools participate in training and then still have a negative program review finding. Because when we see these patterns, it probably suggests that we need to do a better job with training, or that maybe our regulation just doesn't make sense. And so we are using these feedback mechanisms to hold ourselves accountable, to make sure that the changes we make have the intended effect on borrowers and on our partnership with all of you. We are launching our new PPO, which is our new portal for all of you, our partners, to make it easier for you to access our various systems. We've tried to listen to your concerns about verification, and we've changed our requirements around verification, allowing that tax documents other than the transcript can be used to verify income. And we also understand that for some students, they are not going to be able to get that information from their parents. And so we've made it possible for youth to use professional judgment and to use attestation as a way to verify those students who just cannot access information. Along those same lines, in response to COVID-19, we've put guidance out to make it clear that we expect greater utilization of professional judgment in the coming year. We know that students and families have had changes in income, and we know that you will have increased reliance on professional judgment to package students' aid awards this year and well into next year. And so we've made it clear that an increased use in professional judgment alone is not going to trigger a program review. We know that you're doing that to be responsive to the needs of your students. And so we've put guidance out to share with you that this is not going to trigger a program review. We've also heard what you've said about certain programs and our experimental sites initiatives. We've launched a new experimental site to expand opportunities through federal work study. We know that among students who have to work, many of them have to work more than 10 hours a week. And we want to make sure that they can use federal work study dollars to meet those needs, to work 20 or 30 hours a week. But if a student is going to work that many hours, wouldn't it be better if that work was linked to the student's program? Wouldn't it be better if that employer had a vested interest in the student's academic success? And we think institutions can partner better with off-campus employers by saying, hey, not only do we want to partner with you on the academic content of our program, but through our federal work study program, we can offer some financial incentives to help pay for some of those hours that the students are working, as long as you work with us to make sure that that work aligns with the student's academic program. We also understand that student teaching and nursing clinicals are a really important part of work-based learning. And we think it's silly that students who were eligible for federal work study could not get federal work study dollars to support themselves while they were in those required elements of their program. And so under our federal work study experiment, we have just over 200 schools that now have the opportunity to offer federal work study eligible students the continuation of federal work study wages while they're doing student teaching or while they're doing nursing clinicals. And so we think for lower income students that once had to choose between work and completing their program, that was an artificial choice that they were forced to make. Now what we're saying is work-based learning is part of your academic program, and you can be paid for those hours. We've also started a new cohort of the Second Chance Pell experiment. We know that when individuals who are incarcerated have an opportunity to become educated and to develop workplace skills, they are much more likely when they rejoin their communities to get work and to integrate with their families and communities in a way that makes them feel productive and that in fact will make them productive. And so we have started a new cohort of our Second Chance Pell experiment. We have changed the way we are looking at program reviews. We understand that many of you had concerns that we were basically doing rulemaking or regulatory changes through the enforcement process, and that's not fair to institutions. We now have checks and balances to make sure that a program review enforces the regs as they are written, but doesn't create new regulations or impose new burdens that haven't been through the rulemaking process and that you were unaware of before the program reviewer came to your campus. So we think that we've made a number of important changes to show you that we're listening, that we hear you, that we want to be responsive to your needs, and that we're holding ourselves accountable. And certainly we've tried to be responsive, as have you, in the wake of COVID-19. The president and the secretary before the CARES Act had moved student loans into a 0% interest, zero payment requirement for loans that were owned by the Department of Education, and we've given flexibility to our FEL lenders and to institutions in case they want to have those benefits extended to FEL loaners and those who have Perkins loans. And so we've been quick, very quick, to get students into the 0% interest, into the $0 payment status. And as you well know, the president issued a memorandum several months ago to say when the CARES Act ended at September 30th, we would, through executive action, continue those benefits to borrowers through the end of the year. And so we've also tried to be responsive by making sure that we extend to you the benefits of return to Title IV changes that were created by the CARES Act. We've made distance learning available to international institutions and foreign schools that participate in our programs. So we were very quick to implement the CARES Act, and we have continued to delay certain reporting deadlines, understanding that the most important thing for you to do is to serve your students. And given the challenges that many of you have in even getting to campus, we wanted to give ample time so that you could complete your reporting obligations in a way that wouldn't detract from all of the work you were trying to do to accommodate your students, and that gave you a chance to get it right. And finally, you know that we have launched a new Section 117 reporting portal. We understand that it was complicated for institutions to know which gifts had to be reported, but we also know how incredibly important it is to be transparent about sources of funding that come to institutions from foreign governments and foreign entities. So we think that our new portal will make it easier and more clear how to report those obligations, and we appreciate that so many of you have gone in and corrected your 117 reports to make clear how much funding is being received from foreign entities. And finally, we have posted our cohort default rates in a new way this year. We think that the reliance on percentages was somewhat deceptive. And so I'm going to read because I want to make sure I get the numbers right. But we have always in the past published the percentages under cohort default rates. But what's more important to borrowers is how many borrowers are in default. And what's most important to taxpayers is how many dollars are in default. So, for example, under our two-year institutions, we have reported that public institutions have a 15.2% cohort default rate, which represents 98,000 borrowers and $790 million. Private two-year schools have a 15.4% default rate, which means 6,000 borrowers are in default on $63 million. And among proprietary two-year schools, it's an 18% cohort default rate that represents 35,000 borrowers and $320 million. Among our four-year schools, public institutions post a default rate of 7.1%, but it's important to know that that represents 121,000 borrowers and $1.8 billion. Private institutions have a 6.5% rate, but it's only 64,000 borrowers, but for a total of $1.1 billion. Proprietary institutions have a 13.1 cohort default rate, 13.1%, and that represents 68,000 borrowers and $917 million. I mention this because we have been so reliant on percentages, but percentages can be deceiving because they don't tell you how many borrowers. We know that when there are 121,000 borrowers and $1.8 billion in default, we need to do better. We need to figure out how to reach those borrowers, how to educate those borrowers, and how to help them get into repayment. Because what we all know is that there is no reason for any borrower to be in default, given the many ways that they can meet and fulfill their repayment obligation, including with small, even $0 payments. So I know that was a really quick run through many of the activities, but I just wanted to make clear to you, we are listening. We have heard you. We do want to be better partners. And I continue to invite you. In fact, I urge you, reach out to me and to us when you have concerns. If there are additional ways that we can be helpful, please make us aware of them. I think we've shown that we will be responsive to you, that we hear you, but we know that we haven't solved every problem. So we urge you, our partners, to come forward, to tell us when you have concerns. And I just want to end by once again thanking you for the tremendous work you've done, especially over the last 8 months, to help students through such challenging times, to continue to ensure that Americans have opportunity and access to continue and complete post-secondary education. We thank you for all you do. We congratulate you for your many, many successes, and we wish you the best for you, your families, your campuses, and your students to stay well and to succeed. Thank you so much. Bye bye.